Good morning, and thank you, Andrea. Eva Hussein from Polaron here. Today, we're going to be talking about the English language, which you think, why are they talking about English given that they're a translation company? There's all kinds of reasons, but firstly, let me welcome our special guest, Dominic Carter, to our special show. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Okay, now at Polaron, you work as a systems and finance director, which is a bit of a departure from what you've been trained in and where you worked prior to coming on board with Polaron, but not really, because I think language and systems are very much aligned. So could you tell us a little bit more about your background and, maybe starting with the fact that you are truly bilingual and, what languages you speak, things like that.
Okay, so a little biographical information, I guess. I am indeed the director for finance at Polaron and Systems, and yet I have studied French literature, French language and literature, and I studied it in England so that I could keep both my languages and my main language in ship shape. I was brought up by two translators. So conversations about semicolons were frequent at our dinner table. And we're all keyed on grammar and things like that. So, and apparently I still to this day keep a rather large vocabulary. So even after 10 years at Polaron, I speak to people and they go, what is this word that you've just used? And it's the word that springs naturally to me. So I've studied French, French literature, French theory of literature as well, for some reason. And it's a very interesting thing because the rules that, for example, govern grammar, govern all sorts of other things. They're there. So grammar is a form of maths, for example. Or if you look at psychology, they use the language of dreams, for example. If you dream of violets, you're dreaming of violence because they sound the same. So there's a figure of speech to cover that. So language sort of spills into all sorts of other domains, which is why it's fascinating.
It is indeed. So with English, though, which is what we're going to be talking about today, there's some strange things that have happened with English, I guess. So I think roughly there's around 6,000 languages in the world, and we speak fewer and fewer of them, of course, because they're dying out. So Australian Indigenous languages are a very good example where at the time of settlement, actually nobody knows how many languages there were, but it's estimated between 300 and 600, and at the moment there are approximately 45, and some of them are spoken by just one or two people. But with English, it's would you say that it's a language of conquerors? Is it a language of is it a hungry language that keeps absorbing and taking over, or quite the opposite? Because I think two different things are happening with English. One is that more people speak it, but the other thing is that it's more of an international language. And I read in preparation for this session that more people speak English as a non-native language, so as their second or third or even fourth language than native English speakers. Could you maybe shed some light on that for us?
Okay, yeah, up to a point, I guess. First of all, languages are dying all the time. They estimate, I think, that maybe a language dies every 2 weeks. And that's not too surprising because about 98% of languages are spoken by a very, very small number of people. And then in the other 2%, you have three categories of languages. The biggest one being national languages, like in Ukraine, they speak Ukrainian. In the Czech Republic, they speak Czech. Then you have sort of super languages like Arabic, which is spoken in several countries. And there's, so there'll be a Hindi as well, and a few languages with lots of speakers that are spoken across regions. And then in a category of its own, you have English, which is the most spoken language, even by numbers. So there are a few ways you can work out if a language is big. The number of native speakers is definitely one. If you go by just the number of native speakers, of course, then you go with Chinese, China, because
Mandarin.
everybody speaks Mandarin, or 1.2 billion people, something like that. So that's a very, very large number. Whereas native speakers of English, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's around 350 million or so. If you look at the population of the States, it's about that much. Yet, of course, there's people that speak English as a mother tongue in England, for example, and Canada, and so on. So how did English become the biggest language? You can look at the other languages such as Arabic and Spanish and French, and they traditionally spread through a few means. Colonization, of course. In America, they speak English because, hey, England had a good navy. They traveled around the world and went, hello, let's plant a flag here and let's plant a flag there. In India, they still have English newspapers. So colonization is definitely one thing, and that will also be to the detriment of whatever native languages are sitting there. You've mentioned Australia. That's happened here. You can clearly see a number of languages dying there. What else happens? Trade. So again, the very same boats with which you travel to invade countries, you can use to carry spices and cheddar, whatever it is that you're exporting. And then trade becomes, you need to talk to the people you're trading with. And this trade notion becomes really important in probably the next phase, which is since the Second World War, since after the Second World War, English has just run into a massive lead ahead of everybody else. And that's because, why is it? The digital era, I guess. So the digital era has collapsed distances. You no longer need boats, trains, and cars to go around the world. You can go around the world by typing on your keyboard. So the massive proportion of content on the internet is in English. Why? Probably because Americans invented the internet. So they ran with it and they got ahead of the curve. So by that point, everything is English. All the users of the internet, most users of the internet will see English content, have a reasonable grasp of English. The percentages I'm not too aware of at the moment, but I had statistics from 2013 and it said something like 56% of people are English speakers on the internet.
Right. And there's a few, I guess, phenomena that are nobody can explain. So, for example, one of the things we know is that, and you can quote this data because I think we've looked at it when we were preparing, is that like top 500 songs, except for 4, are all in English. The top 500 movies that have ever been made that are popular are all English except for 4 and 5. Why do you think that happens? And could you maybe explain what is happening in that regard?
Yeah, this one's a little more abstract. We don't really know why English songs or English language songs are more appealing to people. It probably just has to do with the whole infrastructure of business happens mostly in English now. Mm-hmm. Advertising, the language of advertising is mostly English. So I was reading, for example, last night, an article where they were talking about English words in German. And then they use English words in advertising. And they use, it makes things look more attractive, more modern, more appealing to people, more universal, I guess. So on the one hand, there's that. So for songs, I presume there's that. The biggest producing companies were English speaking. Even if you're not based in England, the language of business is English now. So that kind of does carry on the momentum of the growth of English things. For films, same thing. In the top 100 movies in the last 10 years, there'll be nothing that's not in English. There's a few, well-loved and well-respected films, by Pedro Almodovar or something like that.
Kind of niche.
But they are niche statistically. They're almost insignificant.
Yeah.
The best film I think was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which made 60% of the money that the fifth 100 film made in the top 500 movies.
Yeah.
So it's still quite insignificant, and everybody's heard of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
But it's not made the money that other things have. So I'm not a native English speaker, as you know. I've tried very, very hard to learn English, and I've lived in Australia for many years, and I still don't feel that, like I don't have some of the skills, I guess, that a native English speaker would have. But I can speak this variety of English, I guess, that's would be considered global or international. So English become a lingua franca at some point. Do we know when, and what is it actually? What does it mean to be a lingua franca? When does it come? Where does it come from, this concept altogether? And we know that there were other languages that performed that duty before English became it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, that's quite a wide question. So let's go with what's a lingua franca, because it goes back to one of my previous answers, which was English as the first language is only spoken by about 350 million, but when you add all the second language speakers, it's slightly above Mandarin. You hit over the billion mark. So I think that about 4% of conversations in English are between two English mother tongue people in the world.
Oh wow!
Only 4%. So that means,
when you and I talk, we're not really.
Yeah, we're not. We're in that 96%.
Okay.
And is English my mother tongue? It's a bit of a strange one.
Right.
I have two mother tongues. So let me just go back to the question. I've lost track of it. How do you become a lingua franca? Precisely by the number of speakers for whom it's not a mother tongue. And prior to that, French was a lingua franca, so the language of diplomacy, typically. And then it lost its power over the last 50, 60 years during the digital era. So really English was on the same level as French and, let's say, Arabic and Spanish, and then it just leapt ahead with the digital era. So French got left behind. Rwanda, I believe, has switched official language from French to English in the last 20 years or so. Some say in spite, against the colonial French sort of history. Mm-hmm. But others to say just to be ahead of the market, and they want to be some sort of digital hub of the African continent. So you become a lingua franca because everybody needs to speak you to be able to operate in the world. So again, it's a sign of the global power of English and how English is spearheading the global movement.
And of course, that comes with. Sorry to interrupt you there. That comes with strange things that happen to the language. So, for example, English doesn't get as much influence into it, I would think, as it influences other languages. So, but it's not always kind of linear and direct and sensical, because as an example, I can give you a word in the Polish language which is mobbing, but what they actually mean is bullying. So somehow, and we were talking about yesterday why that may have been, where there's a word that's got a completely different meaning, and all of a sudden it makes it into another language and acquires a different meaning. So could you maybe comment as to why that happens and some examples of that, maybe?
Okay, so well, let's look at English first, I guess, because every time you use a word is a convention. The meaning of a word is a convention. The actual word itself has no meaning. It's just a symbol, it's a sign, and then we attach a meaning to it. And between speakers of a language, we use that word, and I might mean something slightly different than you when I say sausage, for example. Okay. I might be thinking chipolata or an English breakfast sausage, and you might be thinking Kransky,
right?
For example. So it is a convention, and we kind of take it for granted that we understand each other, and we don't clear up those differences. We don't go, oh, well, what do you exactly mean by sausage? Because the
we might not
conversation,
know what we don't know, right?
exactly, and the conversation might be, more important than sort of nitpicking on what the sausage is.
Right.
So the reasons for that are many. So this misunderstanding. So there's two things. It's how does it happen and why does it happen? Why does it happen is a domain, let's say, that is quite subjective, but mostly it's down to laziness. We as speakers tend to be lazy. Why say something hard when you can say it's something easy? Why spend your time? So there's broadly, the reasons are economy. We just can't be bothered to clarify things, and over time we cut words down. So a motorbike becomes a bike. So that changes the meaning. Well, you look at a bike and there's no motor on it, but there is a motor on other bikes. Why did that happen? Expressiveness. So sometimes we use a word and we mean it slightly differently. Or a word is used so often that we're bored with its meaning and we give it a new meaning. So these are, again, hows. Imperfect learning. You say a word to your child and they think, oh, that means this. And then they start using it. They run around the school. They say it to everybody else. And next thing you know, a word has a new meaning. So that's maybe the whys. Can we have some examples? Example, awful. The word awful originally means full of awe, inspiring wonder.
Oh.
And now it means absolutely the opposite. It means awful. Guy. The word guy in American, Guy, comes from Guy Fawkes. It's a first name, Guy, Guy, from French, and Guy was a sort of terrorist, I guess, in England, who's tried to set fire to the Houses of Parliament and whatever, and that's commemorated. And then that kind of slipped in meaning over time to become a bad person, somebody who's grotesque, and then it just come to mean a person, a man. So that's easy. More contentiously, you could have the word gay. Gay initially means light-hearted and joyous. Yeah. Or my favorite, egregious, which originally meant something really good and now means something really bad, really offensive. So that's that. And then I won't bore you with the technical reasons of how that happens, but it has to do, again, often with the language of grammar and rhetoric. They talk about synecdoche and metonymies and stuff like that. So that describes the technical way in which the word has changed meaning. And if we start looking at words that have been borrowed into other languages, as you can see, it already happens within a language. So when you start going into other languages, it's easy for it to happen. So what the word you gave me was mobbing. So mobbing means bullying in Polish, and you can kind of see how that might happen. It's not so much that there's a mob of people making somebody feel uncomfortable, it's just one person.
Yep.
But otherwise, the essential meaning of that word is reasonably similar. Somebody is made to feel uncomfortable by external forces. So the size of the external forces has been lost through ignorance, economy, whatever the reasons are. And there's so many. If we're looking at Polish, there's so many words that don't quite mean the same thing. Like boot, boot is a shoe.
Yeah,
it's a shoe rather than a boot.
The other interesting thing that we often find when it comes to translation is how a meaning of the word changes in English. So let me give you an example. So for example, we used to call people crippled. We no longer do, and now we say people with disability. But prior to that, we would say all kinds of things, including disabled people. So that's changing because we, the language that we speak, I guess, is more respectful, or there's particular reasons why we say things in a way that we say them. But it doesn't always make it into the other language that we're translating into, or that education that we have around, words like gay or whatever it may be, doesn't, it takes a number of years to make it into other cultures and languages. Have you noticed that in French, for example, which is your second language?
Yes, I guess so. Among the reasons for language change is exactly what you pointed out, sort of cultural environment and cultural pressures, or social prestige is another one. Just class within society, we'll use different words. Have I noticed it with French? I'm trying to think of any examples right now. I can tell you that in French at the moment, they're resisting the invasion of English into their language. They're trying to put barriers up and come up with sensible French-sounding alternatives, like a mobile phone or things like that. They're trying very hard, but the fact is, English is just permeating its way through. They've managed on a couple of things, like Walkman back in the 80s was a brand from Sony. So that would be a synecdoche. We've used something that represents something. And then it became Le Walkman in French. Okay. Everybody's go, oh, Le Walkman, Le Walkman. And then the French authorities thought, well, that's not a very good word. And they came up with Le Baladeur. And they got the whole of the advertising industry to agree to use the word Le Baladeur when describing the machine.
Okay.
So you can still use Walkman as a brand or whatever, but when describing it, and then now it is the word that people use until MP3 players came around. Then
okay.
that whole thing
French,
as well.
French, I guess, is a special language where that influence over time has been lost. And France is often made fun of as having the grammar police or the language police, but it is actually legislated from what I understand. But this power of English is stronger than anything we've seen, I think, in terms of numbers and influences and what happens through technology or, just like when I was growing up, English was a cool language to learn. And, suddenly everybody now in Parliament, which is where I come from, speaks some English to some extent, for sure. But what do you think about, now that we're in Australia, I guess language learning, as we know it, from the European context and model, isn't the same as in, people might be studying a second language, but it never gets to the point where they can speak it because they're not really exposed to it. What happens to your brain when you are bilingual? Do you know much about that?
Oh, I've probably thought about that too much. I don't know what my formal knowledge about bilingualism is, but back quickly to France. There's a law at one point that said 80% of the music played on the radio had to be French. That's to resist this English onslaught of populism and songs popularity. And the European model of learning languages is really good, mostly because, of course, the countries are smaller and less isolated than Australia. And then there's the EU with the trade and the movement of people. So it's much easier. But English has become a lingua franca within that, the most popular one, even though you could use French. Or in Central and Eastern European, they would use Russian initially. And I think English is beginning to creep up in those interactions as well. So it is interesting. Allegedly, it's good for your health to be multilingual. An exercised mind is a long-living mind. If you do crosswords, you don't even have to speak several languages, but keeping your mind exercised is apparently good for your health. And there is some sort of anecdotal evidence that being multilingual is good for your health. It's good for your financial health, certainly. If you speak English, you stand a better chance in life than if you don't speak English. Okay. So it's not just a matter of being bilingual, it's a matter of having the right languages to further your path
Korea.
in life, your career. Yeah. And then what shocks me is when I come to Australia, how Australian English has it has an identity of its own, but it's made of different components. So you have American spelling, some American words, some English words, and then some words, God knows where they come from, like drongo and things like that.
Yeah. And the way that language is truncated, or words are, you have chaza and baza and server and all kinds of things that are very Australian. Yeah, we love them. But listen, we have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll hand over to Andrew in a moment. But I think it's also fair to say that from me, who, again, I'm not a native English speaker, but I've learned English kind of organically. Like I've not got any formal education, or I've not really studied English formally. But I think it's a lifelong journey. At the moment you're studying Polish with our Polish people, and it's a bit of a frustrating thing because they're so different. They're from the same language family, but grammatically they're worlds apart. But would you say that English is like, well, any language actually, you talked about it dying, but there are languages born, like Creole languages and Pidgin languages, which are sort of amalgams or accents or dialects. Like English spoken in Australia is a very good example because it happened over time from migrant, English that developed into something that's a standalone. Australian English is considered a language. Is it considered a language or a dialect, or what is it?
It's not considered different enough to be its own language. Or a Creole or a Pidgin really require a lot more blending of two languages, or two or more. The difference between a Pidgin and a Creole really is how grammatical it is, I guess, how embedded the two languages are within each other. No, so English is called English in America, in Australia, in England. Even within England, you've got the north, the south, and you've got quite a lot of variation in accent and in content of words. So it's definitely the same language. I'm trying to think of the word. I think it's probably isogloss is the word we're looking for. They're lines that are drawn on maps where language is sufficiently different within one language to say it's a regional sort of variation.
Okay, but the Australian English that I speak and the British English variety that you speak, they're mutually intelligible and we can understand each other 99%.
Well, 100%.
Okay. All right, we have time for one question. If we have any, Andrew, over to you, please.
Thank you. We have a few difficult questions for Dominic here. First thing we have, how does modern day migration affect the evolution of the English language?
I would say not too much at the moment, because the other means for English's advance and domination are so vast, like the internet everybody has, so that the movement of people will affect small areas and will affect sort of local varieties of English. So let's say if 10,000 Somalis arrived in Geelong, then they might have an influence on the kind of slang that's used in Geelong, but they won't have an influence on Australian English, if that makes any sense. So I don't think migration plays such a big role anymore. It might squash what's already existing somewhere. If you go into a small village in the Amazon or something like that, and you bring 600 English-speaking people in there, chances are a local language is going to die within a generation for sure. So yeah, I don't think the influence is that big anymore because of the other means by which the spread is happening.
And of course, when people come to Australia, with few exceptions, such as asylum seekers or refugees, everybody's expected to speak English now. And in fact, it's one of the requirements.
Thank you. We have
we have 1 minute.
Time for one. One more?
Any of the
Yeah.
difficult questions is made easy. Yeah, go for
Yeah.
it.
So do you think slang became more popularized in recent years, Dominic?
This land, Australia?
Slang, yeah.
Has it
Aussie
become more
slang,
popular?
okay.
Interesting question. I don't really know. I can tell you one thing. I don't drive. And before I moved to Australia, one of my sisters said, "Oh, well, that's great. You'll be able to drive in Australia without a license." And why on earth would she say that? Because she had this vision of Australia, that's the land of Crocodile Dundee, with sand tracks everywhere and people living in vast areas of nature with nothing happening. I'm not sure why it was so relevant to her, but I think this image of Australia is dying out and being replaced with something more representative of what Australia is. How that's come about, I'm not too sure again. But it could be, for example, popular music. It could be films. It could be all sorts of things, all sorts of cultural aspects. But easy question, but I have no clue how to answer it. I would have to ask the world what they think.
Yeah, and I think slang is an interesting one because it develops again organically. Like sometimes or mostly, I would think even the origins of words aren't very clear. Somebody says something and it becomes popular, and I think it also gets propagated through music, through films, through internet, which is much faster than what it used to be. So that I think that development of language, dying of languages, birth of languages, or slang, or pidgins, or combinations of languages is much faster, and we're watching it as it happens as well. So on that note, we're going to have to go, but that was fascinating and really thought-provoking. So thank you, Dominic, for your time and for explaining some of the more curly aspects of the English language. Thank you, Andrea, for facilitating this, and we'll see everybody next week.
Okay.
Thank you.